For 3 decades, Johnny Carson was America's trusted companion before bedtime. His warm smile, effortless charm, and genuine laugh made millions of viewers feel like they were catching up with an old friend every weeknight. The Tonight Show became more than entertainment. It was an institution, a cultural touchstone that brought the biggest names in Hollywood directly into living rooms across the nation. But when the cameras stopped rolling, when the studio audience filed out, and when the red recording light finally went dark, Carson's famous smile would sometimes vanish completely. According to those who worked closest with him throughout his legendary career, America's beloved host kept a carefully guarded mental list, a blacklist of guests he considered not just difficult or demanding, but genuinely terrible human beings. Johnny was a consummate professional on camera, revealed a former Tonight Show producer who worked alongside Carson for over 15 years. He never let the audience see his true feelings. But the moment we'd cut to commercial, he would occasionally turn to Ed McMahon and whisper something that would make your blood run cold. Things like, "That person should never be near a camera or a child." Carson's unique position as a gatekeeper to America's living rooms gave him an unparalleled perspective on celebrity culture. Every major star, from legendary film icons to emerging comedians, had to pass through his studio to maintain their connection with the public. This meant Carson saw sides of celebrities that few others witnessed. He observed how they treated makeup artists, production assistants, camera operators, and other crew members when they thought no one important was watching. In his final years, before his death in 2005, Carson became increasingly candid with close friends about the celebrities he had secretly despised throughout his career. The stories he shared painted a disturbing picture of beloved icons who were monsters behind their carefully crafted public images. These weren't just temperamental artists or demanding performers. According to Carson, these were genuinely dark individuals hiding behind fame, talent, and the protective machinery of Hollywood's publicity machine. The revelations included shocking accounts of legendary actresses who appeared sweet and vulnerable on his couch, but backstage verbally assaulted young staff members so viciously that security had to intervene. There were stories of beloved male stars caught doing things so disturbing in their dressing rooms that Carson nearly called the police. And there were tales of comedians whose public personas as humanitarians stood in stark contrast to their private cruelty toward anyone who couldn't advance their careers. What follows are the 10 names that earned the most intense spots on Carson's secret blacklist, and the private backstage confrontations, disturbing incidents, and revealing moments that no one has fully exposed until now. Joan Crawford, the Ice Queen with nothing inside. When Joan Crawford made her appearance on The Tonight Show in 1970, viewers witnessed what they expected. The gracious Hollywood legend they'd admired for decades. With her impeccable posture, flawless makeup, and practiced charm, Crawford embodied everything audiences loved about old Hollywood glamour. She spoke elegantly about her career, her films, and her place in cinema history. Behind the scenes, according to multiple Tonight Show staff members who were present that day, Crawford's behavior revealed someone entirely different. Someone cold, calculating, and capable of shocking cruelty toward those she deemed beneath her station. She was one of the coldest people I've ever interviewed, Carson reportedly confided to his authorized biographer years later. It was like talking to a beautiful statue with absolutely nothing inside. No warmth, no genuine emotion, just this perfectly maintained exterior with emptiness underneath. Crawford's appearance began causing problems long before she even arrived at the NBC studios in Burbank. Her list of demands included lighting requirements so specific and detailed that the show's technical director kept a 4-page memo in his personal files for decades afterward, showing it to new employees as an example of extreme celebrity demands. Everything had to be absolutely precise, recalled a former producer who was involved in preparations for Crawford's appearance. The angle of her chair relative to Johnny's desk, the exact height of the desk itself, the specific wattage and positioning of every single light. Even the temperature of the studio had to be exactly 67 degrees. Not 66, not 68. If the thermostat showed anything else, she'd refuse to come out of her dressing room. When Crawford finally arrived at the studio 3 full hours before the scheduled taping, an unusually early arrival for most guests, she brought along her own personal makeup team, despite the Tonight Show employing some of the most acclaimed makeup artists in the television industry. This wasn't presented as a preference, but as a non-negotiable requirement, implying that the show's professionals were somehow inadequate for her standards. However, what truly exposed Crawford's character wasn't her perfectionism or her demands. It was a stark difference in how she treated people based on their perceived importance in the Hollywood hierarchy. She practically curtsied when speaking to Johnny, recalled a stagehand who witnessed the entire day. The deference was almost embarrassing, all smiles and Mr. Carson this and Mr. Carson that. But the moment she dealt with anyone below a certain level, it was like watching someone flip a switch. The warmth disappeared completely. The incident that became legendary among Tonight Show staff occurred when a young production assistant, a 20-year-old woman just beginning her career in television, made the simple mistake of entering Crawford's dressing room at the wrong moment. The assistant was responding to Crawford's own request, bringing a glass of water with specific ice requirements that Crawford had demanded, but her timing was apparently off by a few minutes. According to multiple witnesses who were in the hallway and could hear every word, Crawford launched into a verbal assault so vicious and sustained that experienced crew members, people who'd worked in Hollywood for years, stood frozen in shock. Crawford allegedly called the young woman a brainless little bitch and suggested she should find work at a brothel where incompetence might actually be considered an asset. The production assistant fled the dressing room in tears, her hand shaking so badly she dropped the water glass in the hallway. Crawford then demanded, not requested, but demanded, that the young woman be fired immediately and removed from the studio before the taping began. Carson's producer, to his eternal credit in the eyes of the staff, flatly refused. This created a tension that hung over the entire production, with Crawford making her displeasure known through icy silence and pointed glares at crew members throughout the preparation and taping. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Crawford's appearance wasn't just a cruel treatment of staff. It was a calculating, mechanical way she transformed the instant the cameras began rolling. She was like a machine pretending to be a woman, one producer recalled decades later. Every single moment was rehearsed and calculated. Every laugh, every spontaneous seeming reaction, every bit of warmth. It was all carefully scripted performance. There was nothing genuine about any of it. During commercial breaks, Crawford would immediately drop her smile, like removing a mask, sitting in stone-faced silence and refusing to engage with anyone around her, including Carson himself. Then, the moment the red recording light came back on, she would instantly reanimate, smile returning, warmth flowing, as if someone had flipped a switch. Carson, renowned for his ability to put even the most nervous guests at ease and find authentic connections with celebrities from all backgrounds, struggled throughout the interview to find anything real beneath Crawford's polished surface. After the show concluded and Crawford had finally left the building, Carson reportedly turned to Ed McMahon and said with uncharacteristic bluntness, "I've interviewed corpses with more personality and warmth than that woman." Years later, when Christina Crawford's explosive memoir, Mommy Dearest, was published, revealing allegations of severe physical and emotional abuse behind closed doors, Carson wasn't remotely surprised. According to close friends, his only response was a quiet nod and the simple statement, "I saw exactly who she really was in those few hours we spent together." I believe every single word of that book. Frank Sinatra, the charming bully Carson couldn't stand. On screen, Frank Sinatra and Johnny Carson appear to share a cordial, even warm relationship. The legendary singer would joke with easy charm, tell entertaining stories from his incredible career, and occasionally perform, while Carson played the role of respectful host, clearly aware he was in the presence of one of entertainment's true giants. Behind the scenes, however, Carson harbored a deep and abiding dislike for Sinatra, not for his undeniable talent, which Carson genuinely respected, but for how Old Blue Eyes treated people when he believed no one important enough to matter was paying attention. If he didn't sing, he'd be a mob enforcer. Carson once confided to a close friend, according to multiple biographies. And sometimes, I think he managed to be both simultaneously. Sinatra's appearances on The Tonight Show became notorious among crew members for the atmosphere of tension and intimidation they created. According to longtime staff members, Sinatra never arrived alone. He would sweep into the NBC studios accompanied by an entourage of up to 8 men who were described by one veteran cameraman as definitely not show business types, More like guys you absolutely wouldn't want to encounter in a dark alley. These men, whose exact relationship to Sinatra was never clearly explained, would spread throughout the studio during rehearsals and taping, watching staff members with cold, evaluating stares that made even experienced television professionals deeply uncomfortable. It was like being under surveillance, recalled a cameraman who worked several of Sinatra's appearances. These guys would just stand there, not talking to anyone, not doing anything productive, just watching. They'd position themselves near exits, near the control room, near the dressing rooms. It created this atmosphere where everyone felt like they had to be on their absolute best behavior, or else, though no one wanted to think too hard about what or else might mean. But what truly disturbed Carson was witnessing firsthand how Sinatra treated people he deemed beneath his station, which, in Sinatra's apparent worldview, included virtually everyone except a small circle of fellow superstars and powerful industry figures. The incident that nearly caused Carson to cancel a scheduled Sinatra segment occurred during one appearance in the early 1970s. A floor manager, following standard Tonight Show protocol, approached Sinatra during pre-show preparations to give him the customary 3-minute warning before his segment would begin. According to multiple witnesses who saw the interaction, Sinatra's response was swift and physically aggressive. He grabbed the floor manager by his necktie and pulled him close, his face inches away, and said in a menacing voice loud enough for those nearby to hear clearly, "Nobody tells me when I got 3 minutes. I'll go on stage when I'm goddamn ready, and not 1 second before. You understand me?" The floor manager, a Korean War veteran in his 50s who had worked in television for over 20 years, was visibly shaken by the encounter, his hands trembling as he backed away. Carson, watching this interaction unfold on the monitor in his office, was furious. He immediately called a producer and said he wanted to cancel Sinatra's appearance entirely. Only the producer's desperate reminder about the ratings boost Sinatra's presence would bring, combined with the logistical nightmare of filling a last-minute cancellation, convinced Carson to proceed with the segment. Another persistent source of tension was Sinatra's profound unreliability despite his superstar status. He canceled appearances at the last minute on multiple occasions, including one particularly egregious incident where he was already in the building, had been through hair and makeup, and then simply decided, 2 hours before taping, that he wasn't in the mood and left without explanation or apology. Perhaps the most telling moment in the Carson-Sinatra relationship came during a commercial break, when Sinatra made a crude, disparaging comment about a female staff member's physical appearance, loud enough for everyone in the immediate vicinity to hear, clearly intending it as some sort of joke at the woman's expense. Carson, breaking his usual professional detachment and his general policy of avoiding confrontation with guests, turned to Sinatra with an icy stare and said in a firm, quiet voice, "We don't talk about my staff that way here. Not ever." The tension was palpable. Sinatra, clearly unaccustomed to being challenged by anyone regardless of their stature, looked visibly surprised that even Johnny Carson, arguably one of the few people in entertainment with comparable power, would dare to push back against him. When the cameras returned from commercial break, both men maintained their professional facades to the audience at home, but crew members noticed that Carson's questions became noticeably shorter and less engaged, his body language subtly closed off. After that appearance concluded, Carson made his feelings crystal clear to his producer. "I don't care what kind of ratings he brings or how legendary his career is. Limit Frank Sinatra to once a year maximum, and make sure I'm consulted before any booking is confirmed." What makes this particularly significant is that Carson rarely involved himself in the day-to-day booking decisions and almost never banned guests outright. For him to specifically restrict Sinatra's appearances spoke volumes about his personal distaste for the singer's behavior. Orson Welles, the genius who thought rules were beneath him. Orson Welles appeared on The Tonight Show multiple times during the Carson era, invariably generating memorable television with his distinctive booming voice, larger-than-life physical presence, and remarkable stories from his legendary career spanning film, radio, and theater. Viewers at home saw a charming, brilliant raconteur who could hold an audience spellbound. Carson and his staff saw something quite different. A man whose massive ego had grown so enormous that he genuinely believed normal rules of television production simply didn't apply to someone of his stature and genius. Never again, Carson reportedly declared after one particularly challenging Wells appearance. That guy thinks he's still directing Citizen Kane, or maybe thinks he's still running Rome as Caesar. The problems with Wells typically began well before he even arrived at the studio. According to Tonight Show writers who worked on preparing his segments, Wells routinely dismissed any prepared questions or suggested topics that Carson's team had carefully developed. He told us, in no uncertain terms, that our questions were pedestrian and obvious, recalled one former writer, still sounding amazed by the audacity decades later. He literally crossed them all out with a thick black marker and handed back what was essentially a blank page. This meant Johnny had interviewed one of cinema's most significant figures with essentially no preparation or framework, which, for someone as thorough as Johnny, was an absolute nightmare. This created particular challenges given Wells's well-documented tendency to launch into lengthy, meandering stories that were fascinating but nearly impossible to edit for time constraints and difficult for Carson to redirect or interrupt without appearing rude to a guest of Wells's stature. During one appearance in the mid-1970s that became legendary among Tonight Show staff, Wells was scheduled for a standard 7-minute segment, the typical allocation for a single guest in a multi-guest episode. He remained on the couch, talking without pause, for nearly 25 minutes, completely ignoring multiple subtle cues from Carson that it was time to wrap up his segment. Johnny had a whole series of signals he would give guests when time was running short. Explain a director who worked on the show for many years. There was a lean forward, the glance at his cards, the specific way he'd nod and try to interject. Wells saw them all, understood exactly what they meant, and just kept talking. We had to bump 2 other guests entirely from that episode. People who had flown in from other cities specifically to appear on the show. Wells's behavior toward staff was equally dismissive and revealed his apparent belief in a rigid social hierarchy, with himself at the pinnacle. He reportedly refused to speak directly to production assistants or lower-level crew members, instead addressing them in the third person even when they were standing directly beside him. "Tell the girl I need more water," he would announce to no one in particular, rather than simply asking the assistant present. Or, "Ask the boy to adjust that light," when a lighting technician was right there. This deliberate refusal to acknowledge crew members as autonomous individuals worthy of direct address created an uncomfortable atmosphere that staff members found both insulting and bizarre. What particularly irritated Carson, according to those who knew him well, was Wells's fundamental misunderstanding of whose show this was. Rather than treating The Tonight Show as Carson's program, which it absolutely was, Wells seemed to view it as a platform that existed for his own use and amusement. Orson would bring props without telling anyone in advance, change topics without warning, and even attempt to direct camera shots from his seat on the couch, explained a former producer, still amazed by the behavior. During one appearance, he actually stood up in the middle of the segment and tried to tell our camera operators which angles to use and how to frame him. Johnny was absolutely livid. The post-appearance conversation between Carson and Ed McMahon after that particular Wells visit became part of Tonight Show lore. "Genius doesn't excuse everything," Carson reportedly said. "Being brilliant doesn't give you the right to hijack someone else's show and treat their staff like servants." Carson, himself an absolute perfectionist about television production who understood every technical aspect of creating quality programming, found Wells's cavalier disregard for the medium's practical constraints especially galling. Though he maintained public respect for Wells's immense contributions to cinema and his undeniable brilliance, privately Carson began viewing him as a cautionary tale of what happens when extraordinary talent becomes completely eclipsed by unchecked ego. After Wells's final Tonight Show appearance, Carson made it clear to his booking staff that future Wells visits should be extremely rare and only when there was compelling reason, a major new project, or a significant career milestone that justified dealing with the chaos his presence inevitably created. Bette Davis, Hollywood's queen of verbal violence. When Bette Davis appeared on The Tonight Show, audiences saw the legendary actress at her most engaging, telling witty, sharp stories in her distinctive voice, elegant even in her later years, and filled with fascinating anecdotes from Hollywood's golden age. Her performances on Carson's couch were masterclasses in how to command attention and entertain an audience. What viewers didn't see were the moments before and after the red recording light came on, when Davis revealed a personality so abrasive, combative, and verbally aggressive that even the unflappable Carson was taken aback. "She doesn't need a stage. She needs a courtroom," Carson allegedly told Ed McMahon after one particularly difficult Davis appearance. No one should have to be cross-examined by Betty Davis without a lawyer present and a defense strategy prepared. Davis's first offense, according to multiple Tonight Show staff accounts, was her treatment of other guests when she appeared on multi-guest episodes. She would interrupt or talk over them without hesitation, especially if they were younger performers or women she perceived as competition. Even decades into her own legendary career, she would physically turn her back on other guests sitting on the couch, recalled a former talent coordinator who worked on several Davis appearances. If someone else was in the middle of telling a story that was getting laughed from the audience, you could literally see her seething, her jaw clenching, as she planned how to regain control of the conversation and redirect attention back to herself. Behind the scenes, Davis's behavior was even more problematic and revealed troubling patterns. She reportedly demanded whiskey in her dressing room before appearances, not particularly unusual for guests of her era and generation, but her alcohol consumption sometimes led to inappropriate comments and behavior that made staff members deeply uncomfortable. According to female staff members who worked on the show during the 1970s, Davis regularly used language and made comments that were shockingly sexist and racist, even by the less enlightened standards of that time period. Her verbal attacks could be withering and personal, targeting physical appearance, intelligence, and competence. One makeup artist recalled with lingering discomfort an incident where Davis refused her services, asking instead for someone whose hands don't shake like they're coming off a 3-day drunk. The makeup artist, a consummate professional with years of experience, had a minor essential tremor, a harmless medical condition. That Davis chose to mock cruelly rather than simply making a polite request for someone else. Carson, who generally avoided confrontation and preferred to let producers handle difficult guest situations, made a rare exception when Davis began verbally berating a cue card holder during a rehearsal, attacking the young man for being too slow, with theatrical viciousness that went far beyond constructive criticism. Johnny actually stepped in personally, remember production assistant who witnessed the incident. He approached very quietly and said in this calm but absolutely firm voice, "Miss Davis, on this show we speak to everyone with respect, or we don't speak at all." She was genuinely stunned, probably not used to being challenged, especially by someone being so measured and polite about it, but she backed down immediately. What made Davis particularly difficult for Carson was the uncomfortable contrast between her undeniable talent and her treatment of others. Unlike some difficult guests who could be mentally dismissed as talentless or overrated, Davis was a genuine legend, a 2-time Oscar winner whose work Carson genuinely admired and respected. This made her behavior all the more disappointing and harder to reconcile. After a final appearance on The Tonight Show in the early 1980s, Carson reportedly told a producer with finality, "That's the last time. Life's too short to spend it being verbally flogged by Betty Davis, no matter how many Oscars she has on her mantelpiece." The decision to quietly blacklist Davis, never officially announced, simply implemented through the booking process, spoke to how strongly Carson felt about her behavior and his unwillingness to subject his staff to her presence any longer, regardless of her star power or the ratings her appearances might generate. Mickey Rooney, the aging star with wandering hands. Mickey Rooney was Hollywood royalty by any measure, the #1 box office star from 1939 to 1941, a child actor who successfully transitioned to adult roles, and a living connection to the industry's golden age who had worked with virtually every major star from the 1930s onward. His appearances on The Tonight Show should have been delightful, nostalgic celebrations of an illustrious career spanning 7 decades. Instead, according to multiple staff accounts, Rooney's visits became increasingly notorious for his inappropriate behavior toward women, chaotic energy, and occasional intoxication, behavior that made crew members uncomfortable and eventually prompted Carson to take unusual protective measures. He thinks being short gives him license to be a pervert, Carson reportedly told a producer after one particularly problematic Rooney appearance in the mid-1970s, his frustration overriding his usual diplomatic restraint. Rooney, by then in his mid-50s, had developed a disturbing reputation among female staff members at NBC for unwanted physical contact, suggestive comments, and a fundamental inability to respect professional boundaries. According to multiple accounts from women who worked on the show during this period, young production assistants would quietly request reassignment when they learned Rooney was booked on an upcoming episode. He would grab your hand when you brought him water, try to pull you closer while making comments about whether you were married or had a boyfriend. Recalled a former assistant who worked on the show in the late 1970s. Her discomfort still evident decades later. If you try to politely extract yourself and leave, he will hold on to your wrist just a little too long, long enough that you knew it wasn't accidental, that he was asserting some kind of control. Even more concerning was Rooney's apparent inability or unwillingness to recognize when he'd had too much to drink before appearances. According to Tonight Show employees, Rooney appeared visibly intoxicated during at least 3 separate appearances they could recall, slurring his words, losing his train of thought mid-sentence, and telling stories that became increasingly inappropriate as his inhibitions dissolved. During one infamous segment in 1977 that became the subject of worried discussions among production staff, Rooney began telling an anecdote about his Andy Hardy co-star Judy Garland that quickly veered into inappropriate territory, forcing Carson to cut him off mid-story and smoothly pivot to a different topic, a rescue that required all of Carson's considerable interviewing skill. During the commercial break that followed, Carson turned to the producer with genuine concern and quietly asked, "Is he drunk, or is this just who he is now?" The producer had no good answer. What made Rooney particularly difficult for Carson to address was the generational gap in understanding what constituted appropriate behavior. Born in 1920, Rooney came from an era of Hollywood where certain conduct toward women, while never actually acceptable, was commonplace and rarely challenged or punished. Johnny was no prude, but had very clear lines about professional conduct, explained a director who worked on the show for many years. Rooney seemed genuinely confused when called out on his behavior, like he didn't understand why it was suddenly a problem. He'd say things like, "I've been doing this for 40 years, as if that was somehow a defense rather than an admission. After one appearance where Rooney made repeated inappropriate comments about a young actress who was also appearing on that night show, Carson took the highly unusual step of apologizing to her personally after the taping concluded. "I've never seen Johnny so embarrassed by a guest's behavior," the director recalled. "He told her directly, 'That's not how professionals act on my show, and it won't happen again.' And he meant it." True to his word, Rooney's appearances became noticeably less frequent in the late 1970s and early 1980s, with Carson reportedly insisting that any future Rooney bookings be scheduled for daytime pre-tapings rather than live evening broadcasts, giving the production team the ability to edit out inappropriate content before it reached viewers. ZSA Gabor, the diva who drove Carson to despair. With her glamorous appearance, distinctive Hungarian accent, and flirtatious personality that played up her multiple marriages for laughs, Zsa Gabor was a Tonight Show favorite who appeared dozens of times during Carson's long tenure. Viewers saw a charming, deliberately over-the-top personality who understood how to entertain and seemed to be in on her own joke. Behind the scenes, according to numerous staff accounts, Gabor was one of the most demanding, high-maintenance guests in the show's entire history, someone whose requirements and behavior created logistical nightmares that affected entire production schedules. "I'd rather interview a cat," Carson reportedly quipped after a particularly exhausting Gabor appearance, his patience finally exhausted. At least the cat wouldn't need 3 assistants and special lighting flown in from Los Angeles. Gabor's demands began long before she arrived at the studio, with her requirements list becoming legendary among Tonight Show staff for its specificity and absurdity. According to former employees, her standard requirements included a specific temperature in her dressing room, exactly 74 degrees, monitored constantly fresh flowers, but only orchids, with explicit instructions that carnations were unacceptable, a bottle of Perrier water with exactly 3 ice cubes, not 2, not 4, but 3 her own personal lighting technician, flown in at the show's expense from wherever she was staying. No female guests under 40 years old booked on the same episode. Her rider read like a parody of Celebrity Demands, recalled a former talent coordinator, still amazed by the list years later. "We honestly thought it was a joke the first time we received it. But no, she was completely serious, and if every single requirement wasn't met perfectly, there would be consequences." When these requirements weren't met to her exact specifications, Gabor would reportedly refuse to leave her dressing room until the situation was rectified, often delaying tapings and throwing off the entire show's carefully planned schedule, which had ripple effects for other guests and crew members. One of the most infamous incidents occurred when Gabor arrived for a taping and discovered that the makeup department didn't have her preferred brand of foundation readily available. According to multiple witnesses, she launched into a theatrical confrontation with a head makeup artist, demanding that someone be sent to Beverly Hills immediately, a 30-minute drive each way, to purchase the correct product. Johnny actually had to intervene personally. A former producer remembered with a mixture of amusement and frustration. He called her directly in her dressing room and said something like, "Ja, darling, you look absolutely beautiful already, and we have a show to do. Let's save the cosmetics emergency for another day." It was charming but firm. Only Johnny could have pulled it off. What particularly irked Carson about Gabor's behavior was how it affected the overall production and showed disrespect for other people's time and effort. Other guests would be kept waiting in their dressing rooms. Crew members would have to work unexpected overtime, and the show's carefully planned schedule, designed to maximize efficiency and quality, would be thrown into complete chaos. After one appearance where Gabor arrived 40 minutes late without explanation or apology, and then had the audacity to complain about how Carson had introduced her, Carson reportedly told his executive producer with barely contained exasperation, "Next time she wants to be on, tell her we renamed the show The Tonight Show starring Zsa Gabor, and I'll be happy to be her sidekick, since apparently that's the arrangement she thinks we have." Despite these ongoing frustrations, Gabor continued to appear on the show throughout much of Carson's tenure, a testament to her undeniable entertainment value when the cameras were actually rolling and her ability to generate ratings. But staff members always knew that a Gabor booking meant a difficult day ahead, requiring extra planning, additional patience, and acceptance that nothing would proceed according to the normal schedule. Shelley Winters, the unpredictable powder keg. Shelley Winters was a two-time Oscar winner with a remarkable career spanning decades, from glamorous roles in her youth to powerful character parts in her later years. On paper, she should have been an ideal Tonight Show guest. Experienced, accomplished, full of fascinating Hollywood stories, and comfortable in front of cameras. In reality, according to those who worked on the show, Winters was one of Carson's most unpredictable and volatile guests, someone whose behavior could turn a light, entertainment-focused interview into an uncomfortable confrontation without warning. "Shelley doesn't talk, she detonates," Carson reportedly said after one particularly explosive appearance, choosing his words carefully but accurately. Winters became infamous among the show's staff for her inability or unwillingness to adapt to the light, entertainment-focused format of late-night television. Rather than sharing amusing anecdotes, promoting current projects, or engaging in the playful banter that Carson excelled at facilitating, Winters would often launch into intense political diatribes or deeply personal revelations that left Carson visibly uncomfortable and struggling to regain control of the conversation. During one appearance in the mid-1970s that crew members still discuss years later, what began as a simple question about a recent film quickly evolved into Winters delivering a 5-minute uninterrupted monologue about government corruption, CIA conspiracies, and political malfeasance, leaving Carson desperately trying to find a graceful way to transition to a commercial break. Johnny was an absolute master of controlling conversations and steering them where he needed them to go, recalled a former director. But with Shelley, it was genuinely like trying to steer a tornado. Once he got going on a topic, all he could do was wait for her to run out of steam and hope she'd eventually pause long enough for him to redirect. Winters' unpredictability wasn't limited to her conversational topics. She became known for physical volatility as well. In one infamous incident on a British talk show that was widely discussed in entertainment circles, she threw a glass of whiskey directly in fellow guest Oliver Reed's face after he made sexist comments, creating a scandalous moment that made international news. This reputation for potential physical outbursts made Tonight Show staff genuinely nervous whenever Winters was booked on an upcoming episode. Safety concerns, however minor, had to be considered. "We would actually remove certain items from the set when we knew she was coming," admitted a former stage manager, revealing a precaution that spoke volumes about the level of concern. Anything that could potentially be thrown or knocked over in a moment of passion would mysteriously disappear before her segments. Heavy ashtrays, decorative objects, even the water pitcher, we'd replace it with a lightweight plastic version. Despite these significant challenges, what distinguished Winters from some of Carson's other truly difficult guests was that her behavior seemed to stem from genuine passion and deeply held convictions rather than malice, ego, or cruelty. She cared intensely about political and social issues and saw every public appearance, regardless of the venue, as an opportunity and even an obligation to address them. Carson, while visibly uncomfortable during her more intense moments, maintained a certain respect for Winters' authenticity that he didn't extend to guests whose difficult behavior stemmed from ego or entitlement. After one particularly fiery appearance where Winters passionately criticized the Vietnam War and American foreign policy, Carson reportedly told his producer, "I may not want a vacation with her, and I definitely don't want to book her regularly, but at least she means every single word she says." There's no phoniness there, just unfiltered intensity. Nevertheless, Winters' appearances became notably less frequent in the later years of Carson's tenure, with the host preferring guests whose conversational style complemented rather than challenged the show's format, and whose behavior could be reliably predicted and managed. Jane Russell, the star whose politics Carson couldn't stomach. Jane Russell was one of Hollywood's most iconic sex symbols of the 1940s and 1950s, known for films like The Outlaw and Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. With her striking beauty and significant place in film history, she seemed like a natural recurring guest for The Tonight Show, someone who could share fascinating stories from Hollywood's golden age. Yet after a few appearances in the early 1970s, Russell rarely returned to Carson's couch, a decision that, according to show insiders, stemmed directly from Carson's deep discomfort with her increasingly extreme political views and reported treatment of LGBTQ+ staff members. Carson, while personally a moderate Republican for much of his life, maintained a strict policy of keeping The Tonight Show relatively neutral on divisive political issues. The show was meant to be entertainment and escape, not a political platform. Russell, however, reportedly used backstage interactions to express hardline conservative views that Carson found not just disagreeable, but genuinely troubling. Johnny could handle guests having different political opinions, explained a former producer who worked closely with Carson for years. What bothered him profoundly was when those opinions turned into personal attacks on staff members or other guests, when political beliefs became an excuse for treating human beings with contempt. According to several accounts from people who worked on Russell's appearances, she became notorious for making disparaging comments about LGBTQ+ individuals working on the show. During one appearance in the early 1970s, she allegedly refused to allow a gay makeup artist to work with her, demanding a replacement and making derogatory comments that shocked even crew members accustomed to the casual prejudices of that era. Even more concerning to Carson was a reported incident involving Rock Hudson, one of Hollywood's biggest stars whose sexuality, though not publicly acknowledged at the time, was known within industry circles. According to a talent coordinator who worked on the show during this period, Russell refused to be booked on the same episode as Hudson, making explicitly homophobic comments about him that revealed deep-seated prejudice. Johnny had many friends in the gay community, including several staff members he worked with daily, the talent coordinator recalled. He was genuinely ahead of his time in not tolerating that kind of discrimination on his show. He believed everyone deserved to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their personal life. Carson's final breaking point with Russell allegedly came during a 1973 appearance when she made dismissive, callous comments about civil rights legislation during a commercial break. Though her remarks weren't picked up on broadcast microphones, they were overheard by several crew members, and word quickly reached Carson's ears. The comments revealed views that Carson found not just politically disagreeable but morally objectionable, suggesting that equal rights for minorities were unnecessary or even harmful. For Carson, who prided himself on running a professional, inclusive workplace, this crossed a line. After that appearance, Russell was noticeably absent from The Tonight Show's guest roster for the remainder of Carson's 3-decade tenure. One of the few clear cases where Carson appears to have personally vetoed future bookings based on a guest's behavior and expressed views. What made this situation particularly notable was Carson's general reluctance to ban guests outright, especially those with Russell's level of star power and historical significance to Hollywood. He understood that The Tonight Show was bigger than his personal preferences, and that booking decisions should be based on entertainment value and audience interest. For him to take such a definitive stance against Russell spoke volumes about how strongly he objected to her behavior and how incompatible he found her views with the inclusive, respectful environment he worked to maintain on his show. Jerry Lewis. The comedian Carson called truly hateful. Jerry Lewis was one of America's most successful entertainers, a groundbreaking comedian, actor, director, and humanitarian known for his annual Labor Day telethons benefiting muscular dystrophy research. His manic energy and innovative physical comedy had made him a global star, and his charitable work had raised hundreds of millions of dollars. Behind the scenes, according to numerous Tonight Show staff accounts, Lewis was also one of the most difficult, demeaning celebrities in Hollywood, a man whose cruelty toward those he deemed beneath him earned him a special place on Carson's personal blacklist. He's what happens when ego completely outruns talent. Carson reportedly told a colleague after a particularly troublesome Lewis appearance in the mid-1970s, his contempt barely disguised. Unlike some difficult guests who at least maintained a facade of respect toward Carson himself, Lewis reportedly made no secret of his disdain for the host and the show's format. During one infamous appearance that crew members still discuss years later, Lewis repeatedly talked over Carson, hijacked questions intended for other guests on the couch, and at one point actually reached over and adjusted Carson's tie without permission, a move that visibly annoyed the normally unflappable host. Johnny absolutely hated people touching him without permission, explained a former producer. It was a well-known rule among staff and regular guests. You don't touch Johnny unless he initiates the contact. Jerry Lewis knew this and did it anyway, deliberately, as a power move to establish dominance. Lewis's treatment of crew members was allegedly even worse than his disrespect toward Carson. According to several accounts, he would refuse to learn staff members' names, instead referring to them dismissively as, "Hey you," or simply by their function, camera guy, makeup girl, regardless of their experience, seniority, or accomplishments. This deliberate dehumanization created an atmosphere of discomfort and resentment among crew members who were professionals at the top of their field, working on one of television's most prestigious programs. One particularly disturbing incident occurred when a camera operator reportedly coughed quietly during Lewis's pre-show rehearsal, a minor, involuntary sound that most people would barely notice. According to multiple witnesses, Lewis stopped everything, turned toward the camera operator, and launched into a screaming tirade. Jerry screamed at a camera operator for breathing too loudly, confirmed a floor manager who was present during the incident, not talking during the rehearsal, not making excessive noise, breathing. The poor guy had seasonal allergies. It was completely insane. What Carson found most objectionable about Lewis was a stark, disturbing contrast between his public persona and his private behavior. Lewis would appear on his telethons, often crying as he spoke about Jerry's kids and his love for children with muscular dystrophy, presenting himself as a humanitarian driven by compassion. Then he would come to the Tonight Show and treat adult professionals, people who had done nothing to harm him, with shocking cruelty and contempt. The Jekyll and Hyde routine made Johnny's skin crawl, recalled a producer who worked closely with Carson. He watched Jerry cry on his telethon about loving children, then come to our show and treat people like they were subhuman. The hypocrisy was staggering. After Lewis's final appearance on The Tonight Show in the early 1980s, Carson reportedly told his executive producer with finality, "Never again. I don't care what excuse or reason is given. Jerry Lewis is not welcome on this show." Though Carson rarely banned guests outright, Lewis joined the small, exclusive group of celebrities who were effectively blacklisted from the show during its final decade, a decision that spoke to the depth of Carson's contempt for the comedian's behavior. Years later, when someone mentioned Lewis's name at a private dinner party, Carson reportedly said something that shocked those present with its uncharacteristic harshness and barely contained anger. In a town absolutely full of phonies and hypocrites, Jerry Lewis stands out as truly hateful. And in Hollywood, that takes some serious effort. B.O.B. Hope, America's comedian with a dark side. Bob Hope was American comedy royalty, a legendary entertainer whose career spanned vaudeville, radio, film, and television across 8 decades. His USO tour's entertaining troops made him a beloved patriotic figure, and his numerous appearances hosting the Academy Awards cemented his status as Hollywood aristocracy. By all rights, Hope should have been one of Johnny Carson's most welcome guests. Instead, according to multiple Tonight Show sources, Hope was someone Carson learned to tolerate rather than genuinely enjoy having on the show, a distinction Carson made for very few celebrities of Hope's stature and historical importance. Bob Hope thought he was doing us a favor by showing up, a former Tonight Show producer recalled. He acted like Johnny should be grateful for his presence, like the Tonight Show was some kind of minor stage that was lucky to host him. The fundamental problem with Hope, according to those who worked on his appearances, was his absolute refusal to adapt his performing style to fit Carson's show. Hope came from an era when comedians delivered prepared monologues and worked from scripts. Carson's show, however, was built on spontaneous conversation, quick wit, and authentic interaction. Hope would arrive with pages of prepared jokes, often recycle material from his other appearances, and simply deliver them regardless of whether they fit the conversation or the moment. When Carson would try to engage him in genuine discussion, Hope would deflect back to his script, creating an awkward dynamic where it felt like two different shows were happening simultaneously. It was like watching someone try to perform a Vegas act while sitting on a talk show couch, explained a former director. Bob couldn't turn off the performance mode and just talk like a human being. Everything was set up, punchline, pause for laugh, next setup. More troubling were accounts from female staff members about Hope's behavior backstage. Multiple women who worked on the show during Hope's appearances described unwanted comments about their appearance, inappropriate jokes, and a general attitude that treated young women as objects for his amusement rather than professionals doing their jobs. He'd make these comments that he clearly thought were compliments, but were actually degrading, recalled a former production assistant. Things about how a woman looked in her outfit, suggestions that she should consider acting because she was too pretty to be behind the scenes. It was constant and uncomfortable. According to staff accounts, Hope also displayed a troubling sense of entitlement that extended to how he expected to be accommodated. He would demand specific guests be removed from episodes if he felt they were competition, insist on going last when multiple celebrities were booked, regardless of who was promoting something more current, and attempt to dictate his segment length. What particularly irritated Carson was Hope's apparent inability to recognize that The Tonight Show was Carson's domain, not Hope's platform. During one appearance in the mid-1970s, Hope allegedly told Carson during a commercial break how he should have asked a particular question, essentially trying to direct the interview from the guest chair. Johnny's face got very still, remembered camera operator who witnessed the moment. He said very quietly, "Bob, I've been doing this show for a while now. I think I know how to ask questions." It was polite, but the message was clear. Back off. Perhaps most tellingly, Carson, who was famously generous about crediting the comedians who influenced him, rarely mentioned Hope when discussing the development of his own comedic style. While he frequently cited Jack Benny, Fred Allen, and Groucho Marx as influences, Hope was conspicuously absent from these conversations. After one particularly difficult Hope appearance in the early 1980s, Carson reportedly told Ed McMahon, "Bob Hope was a great comedian in his time. The problem is, he doesn't realize his time ended 20 years ago, and now he's just going through the motions, expecting everyone to applaud because of who he used to be." Hope's appearances became increasingly infrequent in the final years of Carson's tenure, with the bookings taking on an obligatory quality, acknowledging Hope's historical importance while minimizing actual interaction time. Conclusion: what Carson's blacklist reveals about Hollywood. Johnny Carson's private feelings about these 10 difficult guests, Joan Crawford, Frank Sinatra, Orson Welles, Betty Davis, Mickey Rooney, Zsa Zsa Gabor, Shelley Winters, Jane Russell, Jerry Lewis, and Bob Hope, offer a rare, unfiltered glimpse into Hollywood reality behind the carefully maintained facade of glamour, charm, and manufactured persona. Johnny saw everything, explained a longtime Tonight Show producer who worked closely with Carson for over 2 decades. For 30 years, essentially every major star in entertainment had to go through him to reach the American public. He knew who was genuine and who was faking it, who treated people with respect, and who was cruel when the camera stopped rolling. What makes Carson's assessments particularly valuable and credible is that he had absolutely no reason to exaggerate or invent negative stories about celebrities. Unlike tabloid journalists looking for sensational headlines or disgruntled employees with personal axes to grind, Carson was at the absolute pinnacle of the entertainment industry. He had nothing to gain by criticizing these celebrities, and potentially everything to lose if his honesty damaged relationships with potential guests or created controversy. Johnny wasn't looking to make enemies, just the opposite. Noted his former producer, he wanted every single interview to go smoothly, every guest to shine, every show to be successful. When he came to genuinely dislike someone, it was because they had made it utterly impossible not to through their consistent behavior over time. Carson's unique position, simultaneously gatekeeper to mainstream America, confidant to the stars, and arbiter who succeeded in reaching the public, gave him an unparalleled perspective on celebrity culture. For 3 decades, stars revealed sides of themselves on his couch, in his studio, and in backstage interactions that they showed virtually nowhere else, creating a comprehensive understanding of who these people really were beyond their carefully crafted public images. Perhaps most revealing is how Carson distinguished between guests who were merely difficult and those he considered genuinely problematic. He tolerated eccentricity without complaint, understood nervousness, and even accepted moderate ego. Recognizing these traits came naturally with fame and the pressures of public life. What he absolutely couldn't abide was cruelty, especially cruelty directed toward those with less power, the makeup artists, production assistants, camera operators, and other crew members who made his show possible every single night. Johnny had a very simple test that he applied to everyone, recalled his longtime director. How did they treat the pages who escorted them from the green room? How did they speak to the assistants who brought them water? How did they regard the guys working the cameras? That told him everything he needed to know about someone's true character. In the years since Carson's death in 2005, many of his private opinions and assessments have been validated by broader revelations about these celebrities. Christina Crawford's allegations about her mother Joan's abusive behavior, extensive reports about Sinatra's connections to organized crime and his bullying behavior, accounts of Mickey Rooney's numerous instances of inappropriate conduct toward women, and Jerry Lewis's well-documented mistreatment of colleagues have all been corroborated by multiple independent sources. This pattern of validation suggests Carson wasn't simply being judgmental or difficult. He was recognizing genuine character flaws, disturbing patterns of behavior, and moral failings that Hollywood's powerful publicity machine worked overtime to conceal from the public eye. The most sobering aspect of Carson's blacklist is how effectively the studio system, the networks, and the entertainment press protected these celebrities despite their behavior being widely known to industry insiders. Long before the era of social media, cell phone videos, and what we now call cancel culture, stars could maintain pristine public images while behaving abhorrently in private, secure in the knowledge that studios, networks, and publications all had vested financial interests in maintaining their marketability. Today, one cell phone video capturing bad behavior could potentially end a career overnight, observed a former Tonight Show writer, reflecting on how dramatically the landscape has changed. Back then, someone could literally throw a chair at an assistant or verbally abuse a crew member, and as long as they sold tickets or delivered ratings, the story would never leave the building. The protection was absolute. As we look back on Hollywood's golden age with understandable nostalgia, the glamour, the talent, the classic films and performances, Carson's unvarnished assessments serve as a valuable, sobering reminder that our cultural icons have always been fallible, complicated human beings, sometimes inspiring and admirable, sometimes deeply disappointing, and occasionally genuinely disturbing behind their carefully crafted public personas. Johnny used to say something I've never forgotten, recalled his longtime producer. The camera doesn't just add 10 pounds. It adds a thick layer of fiction. His greatest skill wasn't just interviewing people or making them comfortable. It was his ability to see through that layer of fiction to the truth underneath, to understand who people really were when they thought no one important was watching. Carson's legacy extends beyond the laughs, the memorable interviews, and the launching of countless careers. It includes this: a clear-eyed, honest assessment of celebrity culture, a refusal to let fame excuse cruelty, and an unwavering commitment to treating everyone, from the biggest stars to the youngest production assistant, with dignity and respect. In an industry built on illusion and carefully managed image, Johnny Carson insisted on seeing and judging people based on their character and their treatment of others. His blacklist wasn't petty or vindictive. It was moral. And perhaps that's the most important lesson his 30 years hosting The Tonight Show can teach us. That how we treat people when we think no one important is watching reveals everything about who we truly are.